A young woman storms into a boardroom to challenge a billionaire CEO, only for a shocking truth to emerge. She's the daughter he never knew he had. The bustling headquarters of Bradford Enterprises was alive with the hum of efficiency. Executives in tailored suits moved with purpose, their faces set with determination. At the top of the skyscraper, in a sprawling boardroom with floor-to-ceiling windows, an intense meeting was underway. Seated at the head of the table, Richard Bradford, the billionaire CEO, exuded an aura of authority and power. His sharp gaze swept across the room, silencing any dissent before it even began. "Numbers don't lie," he declared, his deep voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. "If we don't restructure the department, we're looking at a significant loss next quarter. It's a decision I've made, and it's final." The room fell into an uneasy silence. None of the executives dared to challenge Richard. His reputation as a relentless and unforgiving leader was well known. He was a man who didn't tolerate weakness or incompetence, and few were brave enough to speak against him. But then, from the far end of the table, a voice broke through the tension. "With all due respect, Mr. Bradford, you're wrong." Heads turned, eyes widening in disbelief. The voice belonged to a young woman, an intern no less. Standing at barely 5 feet 4 inches, her presence was a stark contrast to the seasoned executives surrounding her. Yet her fiery determination made her seem 10 feet tall. Richard's eyes narrowed as he turned his attention to the audacious speaker. "Who are you? And why do you think you can interrupt this meeting?" The young woman met his gaze without flinching. "My name is Elena Carter. I'm an intern in the analytics department, and I've been studying the very data you're using to justify this decision. If you implement these cuts, it won't solve the problem, it'll exacerbate it." The room was stunned into silence. Elena's voice was steady, her argument backed by a folder of meticulously prepared charts and graphs. She stepped forward, placing the folder in front of Richard. "Your proposed changes might save money in the short term," she continued, "but they'll destabilize the department, reduce productivity, and ultimately cost the company more in the long run." Richard's initial reaction was one of annoyance. He was not accustomed to being challenged, least of all by someone so young and inexperienced. But as he flipped through the folder, his expression shifted. The data was compelling, her analysis thorough and irrefutable. For the first time in years, Richard found himself at a loss for words. "I don't know who you think you are," he said finally, his tone a mix of irritation and begrudging respect. "But you've certainly got guts." Elena's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to back down. "I'm someone who cares about this company, Mr. Bradford. Someone who believes in standing up for what's right, even if it's unpopular." Richard studied her for a long moment, his piercing gaze searching for any sign of weakness. But Elena stood her ground, her resolve unshakable. In that instant, he saw something in her, a spark of familiarity he couldn't quite place. Something about her eyes, her expression, tugged at a memory buried deep in his past. "Very well," he said, closing the folder with a decisive snap. "You've made your point. I'll reconsider the proposal." The room was abuzz with whispers as Elena returned to her seat, her heart still racing. She couldn't believe what had just happened. She had stood up to one of the most powerful men in the country, and won. But as the meeting adjourned and the executives filed out, Richard remained seated, his gaze fixed on the young intern. Something about her lingered in his mind, refusing to let go. It wasn't just her courage or intelligence. It was something deeper, something personal. As Elena gathered her belongings, Richard called out to her, "Miss Carter, a word." She turned, her expression wary but composed. "Yes, Mr. Bradford?" He studied her intently, his brow furrowing. "Have we met before?" Elena hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I don't believe so, sir." Richard nodded slowly, but the feeling of familiarity persisted. "Very well. That will be all for now." As she walked out of the boardroom, Richard couldn't shake the nagging thought that he had just encountered someone far more significant to his life than he could have imagined. And as Elena left the towering skyscraper, she felt a similar unease, an inexplicable connection to the man she had just confronted. Neither of them knew it yet, but their lives were about to change forever. Later that evening, Richard Bradford found himself sitting in his penthouse office, gazing out at the city skyline. The confrontation with the young intern replayed in his mind, her words cutting through the usual monotony of his day. There was something about her, her fearlessness, her conviction, that unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite understand. It wasn't just her boldness that lingered in his thoughts. There was something painfully familiar about her features, the curve of her jaw, the fire in her eyes, the determination etched into her every word. It was as though he had seen her before, in a life he had long tried to forget. Richard leaned back in his chair, letting his thoughts drift to the past. Years ago, before he had built his empire, he had been a very different man. Ambitious, yes, but also reckless, selfish, and emotionally distant. It was during that time that he had met Sarah Carter, a woman whose warmth and kindness had briefly pierced through his hardened exterior. Their relationship had been intense but short-lived. Sarah was everything Richard wasn't: selfless, compassionate, and deeply connected to the people around her. She had challenged him in ways no one else ever had, refusing to let him hide behind his ambition. For a while, it seemed like their love might soften him, might pull him away from the ruthless path he was on. But Richard's ambition had won out. When Sarah told him she was pregnant, he panicked. He hadn't been ready for the responsibility, for the sacrifice that fatherhood required. Convinced that a family would derail his career, he had made the decision to leave, walking away from Sarah and the child they had created. He hadn't thought about that part of his life in years, burying the memories beneath layers of success and wealth. But now, staring out at the city lights, he couldn't help but wonder, could Elena Carter be the child he had abandoned all those years ago? The possibility sent a wave of guilt crashing over him. Richard had spent decades convincing himself that his decision had been necessary, that it had been the right choice for his future. But if Elena was his daughter, then he had not only failed Sarah, he had failed her as well. Richard opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a small, worn photo album. Inside were a few pictures from his younger days, including one of him and Sarah. In the photo, Sarah was laughing, her hand resting gently on her stomach, a subtle hint of the life growing inside her. Richard had kept the album hidden away, a relic of a life he had tried to forget. As he stared at the photograph, a lump formed in his throat. Sarah had been right about him all along. He had been too selfish, too afraid to embrace the life they could have built together. And now, if Elena was truly his daughter, he had missed out on decades of her life, moments he could never get back. Determined to uncover the truth, Richard made a decision. He needed to know who Elena really was. He would find out everything about her, even if it meant confronting the painful choices he had made all those years ago. The next morning, Richard instructed his assistant, Clara, to gather information on Elena Carter. Discreetly, he emphasized, not wanting to raise any alarms. Clara, who had worked with Richard long enough to know when not to ask questions, nodded and got to work. As the day went on, Richard found it increasingly difficult to focus on his usual tasks. His mind kept drifting back to Elena, to her fiery determination and the uncanny resemblance she bore to Sarah. If she was his daughter, she had inherited more than just Sarah's looks. She had also inherited her courage and integrity. By the time Clara returned with the information, Richard's heart was pounding. She handed him a slim folder, her expression neutral but curious. "I wasn't sure how much you wanted me to dig," she said, "but this is what I could find." Richard opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside was a detailed profile of Elena, her education, her work history, and a few personal details. She had grown up in a modest neighborhood, raised by a single mother. There was no mention of her father. The realization hit Richard like a punch to the gut. Sarah hadn't named him as Elena's father. She had raised their daughter on her own, without ever asking for his help or support. The thought of Sarah struggling, of Elena growing up without a father, filled him with a profound sense of shame. But then something else caught his eye. A photograph of Elena and Sarah taken just a few years before Sarah's death. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the image. Sarah looked older but still radiant, her arm wrapped protectively around Elena. And Elena, though much younger, already bore the same fire and determination that had struck him in the boardroom. There was no doubt in his mind now. Elena was his daughter. Richard closed the folder, his hands shaking. He had spent years building his empire, convincing himself that his success justified the sacrifices he had made. But now, faced with the reality of what he had given up, he realized just how hollow that success truly was. For the first time in his life, Richard Bradford, the untouchable billionaire CEO, felt powerless. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't erase the pain he had caused, but he could try to make amends, to prove to Elena and to himself that he was capable of being the father she deserved. As the sun set over the city, Richard made a silent vow. He would find a way to earn Elena's forgiveness no matter what it took, because for the first time in years, he had something to fight for that truly mattered. The weight of the revelation sat heavily on Richard Bradford's chest as he entered the office the next morning. The sleek, modern building that housed his billion-dollar empire suddenly felt suffocating. The polished floors, the glass walls, the bustling employees, none of it seemed important anymore. His thoughts were consumed by one person, Elena Carter. He knew he couldn't keep this secret to himself. If Elena was truly his daughter, she deserved to know the truth. But how would she react? Would she see his efforts as genuine? Or would she dismiss him as a man trying to alleviate his guilt? The questions swirled in his mind, each one more daunting than the last. Richard found himself staring at the boardroom door, the very room where Elena had stood her ground against him just days ago. Her fearless demeanor, her refusal to back down, those moments replayed in his mind, fueling his determination. She deserved honesty, no matter how painful it might be for him. As the boardroom door opened, Richard straightened his posture. Elena entered the room, her presence commanding despite her youth. She was here for another routine meeting, her expression unreadable as she set her notebook on the table. "Ms. Carter," Richard began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Could I have a word with you? Privately?" Elena raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard. The other executives exchanged curious glances but said nothing as Richard gestured toward the office down the hall. With a slight nod, Elena followed him, her steps measured and deliberate. Once inside, Richard closed the door, the quiet hum of the office muffling the noise from the hallway. Elena stood by the window, her arms crossed as she regarded him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "What's this about?" she asked, her tone steady but wary. Richard hesitated, unsure where to begin. For a man who had built his career on controlling the narrative, this moment felt completely out of his control. "It's about you," he said finally, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Elena frowned. "Me? If this is about the presentation, I stand by everything I said." "This isn't about the presentation," Richard interrupted gently. "It's personal." Her expression shifted slightly, confusion flickering in her eyes. "Personal? I don't understand." Taking a deep breath, Richard moved to his desk and pulled out the folder Clara had prepared. He opened it to the photograph of Elena and Sarah and placed it on the desk between them. Elena's eyes widened as she recognized the image. "Where did you get this?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "Please, just hear me out," Richard said quickly. "I didn't mean to invade your privacy. I needed to know the truth." "The truth about what?" Elena's tone was laced with frustration, though she couldn't hide the nervous edge in her voice. Richard met her gaze, his eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "Elena, I believe I'm your father." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. Elena stared at him, her expression a mix of disbelief and anger. "What kind of sick joke is this?" she said finally, her voice trembling. "You think you can just walk in here and claim—" "I know it sounds unbelievable," Richard interrupted, his tone desperate. "But I have proof. Your mother, Sarah, she and I were together many years ago. When she told me she was pregnant, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I walked away." Elena's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening as she processed his words. "And now, decades later, you think you can just show up and play the hero? Do you have any idea what my mother went through? What we went through?" "I don't," Richard admitted, his voice breaking. "And I'll never forgive myself for that. But I want to make things right, Elena. I want to be the father I should have been all along." Elena took a step back, her arms tightening around herself as if to shield herself from the emotional storm brewing inside her. "You don't get to decide that now," she said, her tone icy. "You don't get to swoop in and fix things like this as some kind of business deal?" "I'm not trying to fix things," Richard said earnestly. "I'm trying to take responsibility, to prove to you that I'm not the man I was back then. And how do I know this isn't just about your ego?" Elena shot back. "How do I know you're not doing this to make yourself feel better?" Richard took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he placed them on the desk. "You're right to question me. I've spent my entire life putting my ambition above everything else. But meeting you, seeing you stand in that boardroom, it woke something up in me. You're my daughter, Elena, and I don't want to waste another second pretending otherwise." Tears welled in Elena's eyes, though she quickly blinked them away. She had spent her entire life without a father, watching her mother struggle to make ends meet. And now, here he was, this powerful, successful man, claiming to want a relationship. It was almost too much to process. "I need time," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Take all the time you need," Richard replied, his tone sincere. "I'm not going anywhere." Elena stared at him for a moment longer before turning and walking toward the door. Just before she left, she paused, her hand resting on the doorknob. "For what it's worth," she said softly, "my mother never hated you. She always said you had potential to be a good man. I just hope you don't prove her wrong." With that, she walked out, leaving Richard alone in the office. As the door clicked shut, he sank into his chair, a mixture of relief and regret washing over him. He had taken the first step, but he knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain. For the first time in his life, Richard Bradford wasn't thinking about his empire or his reputation. He was thinking about family, the one he had lost and the one he hoped to rebuild. The revelation hung over Richard Bradford like a storm cloud. The confrontation with Elena had shaken him to his core, leaving him raw and vulnerable in a way he hadn't been in years. For decades, he had prided himself on being invincible, a man who could control every aspect of his life with precision. But now, faced with the emotional aftermath of his past choices, he felt utterly exposed. Elena's words echoed in his mind as he sat alone in his office late that night. "You don't get to decide that now." She was right. He couldn't erase the years of absence, the struggles she and Sarah had endured without him. But he could try to prove that he was no longer the man who had abandoned them. The next morning, Richard called Clara into his office. She entered with her usual efficiency, clipboard in hand, but paused when she saw the weight of concern etched on his face. "Clara," Richard began, his tone uncharacteristically hesitant, "I need your help with something personal." Clara raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Of course, sir. What do you need?" "I want to know everything about Elena's life," he said, leaning forward in his chair. "Not just where she went to school or what she's studying. I want to know what she's been through, what she's passionate about, who she is as a person." Clara hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'll do what I can, but are you sure this is the best way to go about it? Maybe you should try asking her directly." Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "She doesn't trust me yet, and I can't blame her. But if I'm going to earn that trust, I need to understand the life she's lived without me." Clara studied him for a moment before nodding. "I'll look into it. But, sir, if I may, trust isn't something you can strategize. It's something you build, one moment at a time." Her words stayed with Richard as he prepared for the day. He had spent so much of his life orchestrating outcomes, ensuring that every decision aligned with his goals. But this wasn't a business deal. It was a relationship, a fragile one that required more than calculated moves. Over the next few weeks, Richard took a more hands-on approach to interacting with Elena. Instead of diving into her personal life with questions she wasn't ready to answer, he focused on small, consistent gestures that demonstrated his sincerity. He invited her to lunch, offering a neutral setting where they could talk without the pressure of the office. He attended her presentations, offering constructive feedback rather than criticism. And he made a point of acknowledging her efforts in front of their colleagues, ensuring she received the recognition she deserved. At first, Elena remained guarded, her responses curt and her demeanor distant. She didn't trust his motives, and Richard didn't blame her. But as time went on, she began to notice the subtle changes in his behavior. He was no longer the aloof, commanding figure she had expected. Instead, he seemed genuinely invested in her success, his support more personal than professional. One afternoon, Richard found Elena in the break room, poring over a stack of documents with a frustrated expression. She barely glanced up as he entered, but he could see the tension in her posture. "Need a second set of eyes?" he asked casually, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Elena hesitated, clearly torn between brushing him off and accepting his help. Finally, she sighed and slid the papers toward him. "It's for the Peterson proposal. The numbers don't add up, and I can't figure out where the discrepancy is." Richard took a seat across from her, scanning the documents with a practiced eye. Within minutes, He pointed to a small but significant error in the calculations. "There," he said, tapping the page. "It's the allocation for projected expenses. Whoever input the data miscalculated the percentage." Elena blinked, her frustration giving way to relief. "How did I miss that?" "You're juggling a lot," Richard said gently. "It happens to the best of us." Elena studied him for a moment, her defenses wavering. "Thanks," she said finally, her tone softer than before. Richard smiled, resisting the urge to say more. He knew that trust couldn't be rushed, and he was willing to let her set the pace. Outside of work, Richard began taking steps to honor the life Elena and Sarah had lived without him. He visited the community center where Sarah had once volunteered, learning about the impact she had made on the lives of others. He donated anonymously to programs that supported single mothers and underprivileged youth, ensuring that his wealth was used to help those in need. But it wasn't just about grand gestures. Richard also sought to understand the little things: Elena's favorite books, her hobbies, her dreams for the future. He paid attention when she spoke, taking mental notes of every detail she shared, no matter how small. One evening, while reviewing some documents in his office, Richard received an unexpected visitor. Elena stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Do you have a minute?" she asked, her tone hesitant. "Of course," Richard replied, setting his papers aside. Elena stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. She held a folder in her hands, which she placed on his desk. "I found this in my mother's belongings," she said quietly. Richard opened the folder to find a collection of letters, old, worn, and filled with Sarah's handwriting. Each letter was addressed to him, written during the early years after their separation. "She never sent them," Elena said, her voice trembling slightly. "But she wrote them anyway." Richard's hands shook as he picked up the first letter, reading Sarah's heartfelt words. She had written about her struggles, her hopes, and her unwavering love for their daughter. Despite everything, she had never spoken of him with bitterness. Instead, her words were filled with a quiet strength, a determination to give Elena the best life possible. "I thought you should have them," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She always said you had potential to be a good man. I guess I wanted to see if she was right." Richard looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't deserve this kindness, but I'll do everything I can to live up to it." Elena nodded, her expression softening. "I hope you mean that." As she left the room, Richard sat alone with the letters, his heart heavy with regret and gratitude. Sarah's words were a reminder of what he had lost, but also a beacon of hope for what he could still rebuild. He vowed, then and there, to honor her memory by being the father Elena deserved and the man Sarah had believed he could become. Richard Bradford wasn't a man accustomed to vulnerability, yet the events of recent weeks had stripped him of every layer of pride and pretense. Elena's gesture, entrusting him with her mother's letters, was more than a simple act of kindness. It was an olive branch, tentative but genuine. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of hope, the possibility that he might be able to rebuild what had been broken. But hope wasn't enough. Trust, Richard realized, was fragile, and earning it would require more than words. It was time to prove, through actions, that he was committed to being part of Elena's life, not as the commanding CEO or the absentee father he once was, but as someone she could count on. The first opportunity came just days later, when Elena faced a career-defining challenge. The Peterson proposal, a high-stakes project she had been spearheading, had hit a major snag. A key client was threatening to pull out, citing concerns about the company's vision for the project. Elena had been tasked with salvaging the deal, a daunting task even for the most seasoned professional. Richard learned of the situation during a routine meeting with Clara. His instinct was to step in, to use his influence and experience to resolve the issue, but he hesitated. This was Elena's moment, her chance to prove herself. Intervening might undermine her efforts and send the wrong message. Instead, he decided to support her from behind the scenes, offering guidance without overshadowing her. That evening, he found Elena in the office conference room, surrounded by charts, notes, and a half-empty coffee cup. She looked exhausted but determined, her focus razor-sharp as she reviewed her presentation. "Need a second opinion?" Richard asked from the doorway. Elena glanced up, her expression a mix of surprise and skepticism. "You're still here?" "I wanted to see how you were doing," he said, stepping inside. This project is important, and I know how much effort you've put into it. She hesitated, then nodded toward the table. I'm trying to reframe the proposal. The client wants more emphasis on sustainability, but I'm struggling to integrate it without compromising the original concept. Richard studied the documents for a moment, then offered a suggestion. What if you highlight the long-term cost savings of sustainable practices? It aligns with their priorities while reinforcing the value of your proposal. Elena considered his words, a flicker of appreciation crossing her face. That could work. Thanks. He smiled but didn't linger, sensing that she needed space. You've got this, he said before leaving the room. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show her that he believed in her abilities. The next day, Elena presented the revised proposal to the client. Richard, who had deliberately stayed in the background, waited anxiously for the outcome. When Elena returned to the office with a triumphant smile, he felt an unexpected surge of pride. They loved it, she announced to the team, her voice brimming with excitement. We've secured the deal. The room erupted in applause, but Richard's attention was solely on Elena. She had faced the challenge head-on and emerged victorious, a testament to her resilience and talent. He approached her after the celebration, his tone sincere. You did an incredible job, he said. I'm proud of you. Elena hesitated, then offered a small smile. Thanks. Your suggestion really helped. It was a simple exchange, but it marked a turning point. For the first time, their dynamic felt less like a battle of wills and more like a partnership. Richard knew there was still a long way to go, but this small victory gave him hope that they could build something stronger. Outside of work, Richard continued his efforts to connect with Elena on a personal level. He respected her boundaries, avoiding any overt displays of affection or attempts to force a relationship. Instead, he focused on learning more about her interests and values. One weekend, he invited her to join him at a community fundraiser for a local youth program. To his surprise, she agreed. The event, held at a sprawling outdoor venue, featured activities ranging from art workshops to sports demonstrations. Richard watched as Elena interacted with the children, her natural warmth and enthusiasm shining through. You're good with them, he remarked as they volunteered at the art station, helping kids paint colorful murals. I used to help my mom with events like this, Elena said, her tone soft. She believed in giving back, even when we didn't have much to give. Richard felt a pang of guilt but didn't dwell on it. Instead, he focused on the moment, appreciating the opportunity to see this side of her. As the day drew to a close, Richard and Elena found themselves sitting on a bench overlooking the park. The sunset cast a warm glow over the scene, and for the first time, their conversation flowed easily. She would have been proud of you, Richard said, referring to Sarah. You've become an incredible person. Elena looked at him, her eyes searching his face. I've always wondered, did you ever think about us after you left? The question caught him off guard, but he answered honestly. Every day, I thought about you and your mother, about the life I could have had if I'd made different choices. But I was too proud and too scared to face the consequences of my actions. Her expression softened, though her skepticism lingered. It's hard to reconcile the man you were with, the man you're trying to be now. I understand, Richard said, and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but I'll keep showing up, Elena, every day for as long as it takes. The words hung in the air, a promise that felt more profound than any grand gesture. For the first time, Elena saw a glimpse of the father she had always hoped for, a man willing to confront his flaws and fight for a second chance. As they left the event together, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it, not as a billionaire CEO, but as a father determined to make things right. In the days following the charity event, something shifted between Richard and Elena. It wasn't an instant transformation. Trust was too fragile, and the wounds of the past too deep. But there was a subtle easing of tension. They began to share more conversations, small moments that allowed them to explore the fragile beginnings of a relationship. Richard approached these moments with caution, determined not to overstep or rush things. He knew the enormity of what he had missed in Elena's life, and understood that earning her trust would take consistent effort over time. One afternoon, Richard invited Elena to lunch at a quiet cafe near the office. It was a modest place, far removed from the lavish restaurants he usually frequented. Elena agreed reluctantly, still wary of his intentions but curious to understand him better. As they sat across from each other, sipping coffee and eating simple sandwiches, Richard broke the silence. "Can I ask you something, Elena?" She looked up from her plate, her expression guarded. "Sure. Why did you decide to intern at Bradford Enterprises? You could have worked anywhere, but you chose this place." Elena hesitated, clearly debating how much to reveal. Finally, she sighed. "I wanted to see for myself what kind of man you were. Mom never talked about you much, but I could tell she had her reasons. I guess I needed to know if she was right." Richard nodded, absorbing her words. "And what did you find?" "That you're not the man I expected," she admitted. "But I'm still trying to figure out if that's a good thing." The honesty of her response hit him harder than he anticipated. It was a reminder of how much he had to prove, not just to Elena, but to himself. "I can't change the past," he said quietly, "but I want to do better. For you. For us." Elena's gaze softened, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she changed the subject, steering the conversation toward lighter topics. They spoke about her hobbies, her plans for the future, and even shared a laugh over a particularly disastrous meeting she had attended earlier that week. For Richard, these moments were a revelation. He was learning who Elena was, her sharp wit, her quiet strength, and the resilience that had carried her through so much. She wasn't just his daughter. She was a remarkable young woman in her own right, and he couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. Later that evening, as Richard reflected on their lunch, he realized how much he valued these glimpses into Elena's life. He decided to take another step toward connecting with her, this time through her passion for art. The following week, Richard surprised Elena with an invitation to an art exhibit at a local gallery. "I thought you might enjoy it," he said, handing her the tickets. "It's a showcase of emerging artists. I know how much you love that world." Elena was visibly surprised but accepted the invitation. That Friday evening, they arrived at the gallery where vibrant paintings and sculptures filled the space. The atmosphere was lively yet intimate, a celebration of creativity and expression. As they walked through the exhibit, Richard noticed how animated Elena became when discussing the pieces. She had a keen eye for detail, pointing out nuances in the artwork that he would have otherwise overlooked. For the first time, he saw her completely at ease, immersed in something she loved. "You have a real talent for this," he said, genuinely impressed. "Have you ever thought about pursuing art professionally?" Elena shrugged. "I considered it, but it's not exactly a stable career path. Besides, I wanted to challenge myself in other ways. That's why I chose business." Richard nodded, understanding her reasoning but also sensing a hint of longing in her voice. "You don't have to choose one or the other, you know. Passion and practicality can coexist." She glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe." As they continued through the gallery, they stumbled upon a painting that stopped Elena in her tracks. It was a serene landscape, the colors soft and inviting, evoking a sense of peace and nostalgia. "It reminds me of a place Mom and I used to visit," she said quietly. "There was this little park near our house. She loved taking me there to sketch." Richard felt a pang of regret. He could picture Sarah, her sketchbook in hand, sitting beneath the shade of a tree with a young Elena by her side. It was a life he had never been part of, moments he could never get back. "You must have meant the world to her," he said softly. Elena turned to him, her eyes glistening. "She gave up everything for me. I owe her everything." Richard swallowed the lump in his throat, his voice thick with emotion. "She did it because she loved you, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to honor that." Elena didn't reply, but the look in her eyes told him that his words had reached her. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, but it was a step closer to understanding. As the evening came to an end, Richard and Elena left the gallery with a newfound sense of connection. The past still loomed large between them, but for the first time, it felt like they were moving toward something better. Back at home, Richard found himself staring at the photograph that had started it all. It was a stark reminder of the life he had missed, but also a symbol of the second chance he had been given. He made a silent vow to continue fighting for that chance, no matter how long it took. For Elena, the evening had been an unexpected glimpse into a side of her father she hadn't known existed. She still had doubts, still carried the weight of the past, but she couldn't deny that he was trying. and for now that was enough. The following week saw a gradual thaw in the icy barriers between Richard and Elena. Their relationship, though far from perfect, began to take shape, defined by tentative conversations and shared moments. Yet, beneath the surface, both father and daughter wrestled with unspoken fears and uncertainties. Elena, despite her growing warmth toward Richard, struggled to reconcile the man she was coming to know with the one she had heard about in hushed tones from her mother. The stories Sarah had shared were laced with both love and heartbreak, painting a picture of a man torn between ambition and personal connection. And now, as Richard tried to step into the role of a father, Elena couldn't help but question whether his efforts were genuine or driven by guilt. Richard, on the other hand, was determined to earn Elena's trust, even as he grappled with his own insecurities. His wealth and influence had always served as his armor, but in the face of his daughter's guarded demeanor, they felt meaningless. He knew that rebuilding their relationship would require patience and vulnerability, qualities he had rarely allowed himself to display. One afternoon, Richard invited Elena to join him for a weekend retreat hosted by Bradford Enterprises. The event, a blend of team-building exercises and strategy workshops, was held at a luxurious resort nestled in the mountains. It was an opportunity for Elena to observe Richard in his professional element, as well as for them to spend more time together. "I'm not sure I'd fit in with your boardroom crowd," Elena said hesitantly when he extended the invitation. "You'll do just fine," Richard reassured her. "Besides, I think you'll find it interesting to see how things work behind the scenes." Reluctantly, Elena agreed. On the morning of the retreat, she dressed in her most professional attire, determined to hold her own among the corporate elites. As they arrived at the resort, she was struck by the grandeur of the setting: sprawling lawns, glass-walled conference rooms, and staff that greeted them with polished smiles. The first day of the retreat was filled with presentations and brainstorming sessions, during which Elena observed Richard in action. He was confident and commanding, his words carefully chosen to inspire and motivate. It was a side of him she hadn't seen before, and though she was impressed, she couldn't shake the feeling that this version of Richard was carefully curated for the public eye. That evening, during a networking dinner, one of the senior executives approached Richard and Elena. "You must be the young intern we've been hearing about," he said to Elena with a smile. "Richard has been singing your praises." Elena raised an eyebrow, surprised. "He has?" The executive chuckled. "Oh, absolutely. He's told us about your initiative, your ideas, and how you've challenged him in the best way possible." Elena glanced at Richard, who looked uncharacteristically sheepish. "I wouldn't say I've challenged him," she replied modestly. "I'm just trying to learn." "Don't be so humble," Richard interjected. "You've brought a fresh perspective to the table. It's something we've needed." As the evening progressed, Elena found herself feeling unexpectedly at ease. The other executives treated her with respect, and Richard made an effort to include her in conversations, introducing her not as an intern, but as a vital contributor to the company. For the first time, she felt like she belonged, not just at Bradford Enterprises, but in Richard's world. The next day brought a challenge that would test their budding trust. One of the retreat's activities involved a high-stakes problem-solving exercise. Participants were divided into teams and given a complex business scenario to address. Elena found herself on a team with Richard and several senior executives, tasked with devising a strategy to save a fictional company from financial ruin. At first, the exercise was dominated by the executives, who quickly took charge of the discussion. Elena observed quietly, unsure of when or if she should speak up. But as the team's proposed solutions grew increasingly convoluted, she couldn't stay silent. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I think we're overcomplicating this. The core issue is the company's lack of engagement with its target audience. We need to focus on rebuilding trust with their customers, rather than just cutting costs." The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at her. For a moment, Elena thought she had overstepped, but then Richard spoke. "She's right," he said, nodding thoughtfully. "We've been so focused on numbers that we've ignored the human element. Let's explore her idea." To Elena's surprise, the team rallied around her suggestion, brainstorming ways to implement her strategy. By the end of the exercise, their team had presented one of the most well-received solutions, earning praise from the retreat's organizers. Afterward, as they walked back to their rooms, Richard turned to Elena. "You were incredible today. She shrugged, though she couldn't hide her smile. I just said what I thought. You did more than that, Richard said. You stood your ground, even when it wasn't easy. That takes courage. Elena glanced at him, her expression softening. Maybe I got that from you. The comment, though casual, struck a chord with Richard. It was the first time Elena had acknowledged any connection between them, and it filled him with a quiet sense of pride. That evening, as the retreat drew to a close, Richard and Elena sat on the balcony of their shared suite, watching the stars. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the distant sound of a nearby stream. Today was different, Elena said after a long silence. In a good way. Richard nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I'm glad you came. It means a lot to me. Elena hesitated before speaking again. I'm still figuring things out. About you, about us. But I think I'm starting to understand you better. Richard turned to her, his expression earnest. Take all the time you need, Elena. I'm not going anywhere. For the first time since their reunion, Elena felt a flicker of hope, not just for their relationship, but for the possibility of healing the wounds of the past. And as they sat together under the starlit sky, it felt like the beginning of something new. The journey of trust and understanding between Richard and Elena seemed to gain momentum after the retreat. However, as their relationship deepened, the unspoken truths about the past loomed larger. Both father and daughter knew that to move forward, they needed to confront the painful events that had shaped their separation. One evening, Elena was in the office late, poring over data for a new project. Richard, noticing her light still on, walked in with 2 cups of tea. You're burning the midnight oil, he remarked, placing 1 cup on her desk. Deadlines don't wait, Elena replied, offering a small smile. Richard sat down across from her. It's been a while since we talked about everything. I feel like there's still a lot unsaid. Elena's smile faded, replaced by a guarded expression. That's because there is. Richard nodded, understanding the weight of her words. If you're ready, I'd like to hear it. All of it. Elena hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of a notebook. It's not an easy story to tell. It doesn't have to be easy, Richard said gently, but it's important. Taking a deep breath, Elena began. When I was a kid, I didn't understand why you weren't around. Mom always said you were busy, that you had important things to do, but as I got older, I realized it wasn't just about work. You chose to leave. Richard winced at her words, but he didn't interrupt. She tried to shield me from the truth. Elena continued, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. She never said a bad word about you, but I could see the pain in her eyes. She worked so hard to give me everything I needed, even when it meant sacrificing her own dreams. Elena's gaze met Richard's, her eyes filled with both hurt and determination. And I couldn't understand why. Why wasn't I worth staying for? Why didn't you fight for us? Richard's heart clenched. He had always known that his decision to prioritize his career over his personal life would have consequences, but hearing Elena's perspective brought those consequences into sharp focus. I was selfish, he admitted, his voice raw. I thought I was doing the right thing by focusing on my work, by building something that could provide for you and your mother, but I see now that I was wrong. I let my ambition blind me to what really mattered. Elena leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. And what about Mom? She gave up so much for me. She never stopped loving you, even when you broke her heart. Richard looked down, shame etched across his features. Your mother was the most selfless person I've ever known. She deserved better than what I gave her. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Then Elena spoke again, her tone softer. She always hoped you'd come back. Even when she got sick, she believed you'd show up. But you didn't. The weight of her words crushed Richard. He had no excuses, no justification for his absence during Sarah's illness. All he could offer was the truth. I didn't know she was sick, he said quietly. By the time I found out, it was too late. I tried to reach out, but Elena shook her head, cutting him off. It wasn't enough. She needed you, and so did I. Richard reached across the desk, his hand hovering near hers. I can't change the past, Elena, but I can promise you this. I will never abandon you again. Whatever it takes, I'll be here. Elena stared at him for a long moment, her emotions warring within her. Part of her wanted to believe him, to trust that he meant what he said. But another part, the part that had been hurt so deeply, resisted. I want to believe you, she said finally, but trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight. I understand, Richard replied. Take all the time you need. I'll prove to you every day that I'm here for the long haul. Their conversation, though painful, marked a turning point. It was the first time they had laid bare the wounds of the past, acknowledging the hurt and the mistakes that had brought them to this point. In the days that followed, Richard began to open up more about his own experiences. He shared stories of his early struggles, the pressure to succeed, and the sacrifices he had made along the way. He didn't try to excuse his actions, but offered them as a way for Elena to understand the man he had been and the man he was striving to become. For Elena, these moments of vulnerability were both challenging and cathartic. She saw glimpses of the father she had longed for, the man her mother had once fallen in love with. Slowly but surely, the walls she had built around her heart began to crumble. One evening, as they worked together on a presentation, Elena looked up from her notes. Do you ever regret it? Choosing your career over us? Richard met her gaze, his expression somber. Every single day. The honesty in his voice struck a chord with Elena. For the first time, she saw the depth of his remorse, the weight of the guilt he carried. It didn't erase the pain of the past, but it gave her hope that their relationship could be rebuilt. As the evening wore on, they found themselves laughing over a shared memory, one of the few moments from Elena's childhood when Richard had been present. It was a small but significant step toward healing, a reminder that, even in the midst of heartache, there were moments of connection worth holding on to. And as they worked side by side, the tension that had once defined their relationship began to give way to something new, a fragile but growing bond that held the promise of reconciliation. In the weeks following their heart-to-heart, the dynamic between Richard and Elena began to shift. While there were still moments of tension and unspoken hurt, a sense of mutual understanding started to take root. They weren't just father and daughter. They were two people trying to rebuild what had been broken for years. Richard made it a point to be present in Elena's life, not just as the CEO she worked under, but as the father she had always deserved. He showed up for her in ways that spoke louder than words, bringing her coffee during late nights at the office, checking in on her during stressful days, and even surprising her with little gestures that reminded her she wasn't alone. One evening, as they walked out of the office together, Richard spoke up. There's something I've been meaning to ask you. Elena glanced at him, curious. What is it? I want to meet your mother's side of the family, he said, his tone sincere. I know I've been absent for too long, but I want to honor her memory by connecting with the people who meant so much to her. The request caught Elena off guard. Her mother's family had always been a source of warmth and love for her, a stark contrast to the distant figure Richard had been. Are you sure? She asked, her voice cautious. They might not welcome you with open arms. Richard nodded, his expression resolute. I deserve whatever reaction they give me, but I need to do this, for Sarah, for you, and for myself. Elena considered his words for a moment before replying. Okay, I'll arrange it. A week later, they found themselves driving to a small town where Elena's maternal grandparents lived. The house was modest but cozy, with a well-tended garden and a welcoming porch. As they pulled into the driveway, Richard's hands tightened on the steering wheel. You don't have to do this, Elena said, noticing his tension. I can go in alone. No, Richard replied, exhaling deeply. I want to. I need to. They stepped out of the car together, and Elena knocked on the door. Moments later, it swung open to reveal an older woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. Elena, her grandmother exclaimed, pulling her into a tight embrace. It's so good to see you. It's good to see you too, Grandma, Elena said, returning the hug. She stepped back, glancing at Richard. This is my father. The woman's smile faltered as her gaze shifted to Richard. There was no mistaking the recognition in her eyes. Richard, she said, her tone a mix of surprise and caution. Yes, he said, his voice steady. It's been a long time. Her grandfather appeared in the doorway, his expression more guarded. What are you doing here? He asked bluntly. I came to apologize, Richard said, meeting the older man's gaze. For everything. The tension in the air was palpable as they were invited inside. Over tea and hesitant conversation, Richard shared his regrets and his hopes for rebuilding the connections he had neglected for so long. He spoke of Sarah with a reverence that softened even the hardest expressions in the room. Elena watched as her grandparents slowly opened up, sharing stories about Sarah's kindness and resilience. It was clear how much they had loved her and how deeply they had resented Richard's absence. But as the evening wore on, the barriers began to crumble, replaced by a tentative understanding.